After 24 years?
Eleanor, please, it's over. You need to accept it.
Richard, what is she holding? You both want the truth? Let's open this envelope.
Wait, Eleanor, don't!
Why? Afraid?
6 months ago, Eleanor Ward believed she'd spend the rest of her life as Mrs. Richard Ward. Today, she's about to spend 20 minutes making sure nobody ever forgets her name again. The rain had just stopped falling on the county courthouse when Eleanor Ward climbed the marble steps alone, her gray wool coat pulled tight against the cold morning air, a single manila envelope clutched to her chest, as if it were the only thing keeping her standing upright. Steam rose faintly from the stone beneath her feet. Somewhere behind her, reporters murmured to each other, their voices low, their cameras not yet pointed in her direction, because as far as the world knew, this was just another ordinary divorce hearing on an ordinary Tuesday in late autumn. But Eleanor Ward was not an ordinary woman, and in exactly 20 minutes, she was going to make absolutely certain that nobody in that courtroom or watching from home would ever forget her name again. 6 months earlier, she believed she would spend the rest of her life as Mrs. Richard Ward. Today, she was about to prove why that belief had been the biggest mistake of her entire life. Her hand trembled slightly against the clasp of the envelope, and for one brief second, it looked as though she might lose her nerve entirely. Then, just as quickly, her fingers steadied. A car door slammed shut somewhere behind her on the wet pavement, but Eleanor did not turn around. She did not need to. She already knew who had arrived, and she already knew what he still believed was about to happen inside that building. He believed he was walking into a formality. He believed the story ended the way he had written it 4 years ago, quietly, carefully, behind her back. He had no idea that by the time this hearing was over, the judge presiding over his case would remove her glasses, look directly at him, and ask the same devastating question 3 separate times. Are you certain this evidence is authentic? Because what Eleanor Ward was about to place on that table was not simply going to end a marriage. It was going to unravel a lie that had been carefully constructed for 4 long years, one lie stacked on top of another, until an entire life had been built on top of a foundation that was never real to begin with. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how Eleanor Ward ended up standing on those courthouse steps with the power to destroy a man's entire carefully built world, you have to go back nearly a year, long before divorce papers, long before a pregnant mistress, long before a single word of the truth had surfaced. You have to go back to a house in a quiet Connecticut suburb, a house Eleanor had chosen the paint colors for, the cabinet hardware for, the exact placement of every window, so the morning light would hit the kitchen counter just right. It was in that kitchen, at 5:40 in the morning, that Eleanor Ward's days always began, long before her husband Richard ever opened his eyes, long before their 2 grown children were even awake in their own separate lives. She would stand at the counter in the pale gray light, coffee brewing, laptop open, reviewing freight manifests and supplier invoices for the logistics company she had spent 24 years helping build from a single leased truck into a business worth tens of millions of dollars. On paper, that company belonged entirely to Richard Ward. His name sat alone on the incorporation documents. His photograph appeared alone in the local business journal features, his handshake alone in every ribbon-cutting ceremony the Chamber of Commerce ever photographed. But anyone who had actually worked inside those offices for more than a few months knew a very different truth, a truth that never made it into any press release. It was Eleanor who caught the 6-figure invoicing error that nearly sank them during the first recession. It was Eleanor who rewrote the contracts that kept 3 of their biggest clients from walking away during the pandemic, when half their competitors closed their doors permanently. Richard signed the checks. Eleanor made certain there was still money in the account to sign them against. And for 24 years, she never once asked for her name to appear anywhere, because she believed, the way so many women of her generation were taught to believe, that being needed was the same thing as being valued. At dinner most evenings, Richard sat across from her scrolling through his phone, answering her questions about his day in single syllables that never quite qualified as real answers. It wasn't cruelty, not in any way she could point to and name. It was simply absence, the kind of quiet erosion that happens so slowly inside a marriage that neither person can identify the exact moment it started. Their daughter Maddie, 19 and home from college for the weekend, noticed the coldness settling over the dinner table long before anyone said a word about it out loud. Their son Daniel, 24 and still fiercely loyal to his father in the way sons sometimes are, brushed it off entirely. "He's just stressed with work, Mom," Daniel would say, refilling his water glass without looking up, the same sentence he had been saying for almost a year without ever once asking his mother whether she believed it herself. It was around that same time that Richard mentioned, almost in passing over dinner one evening, that he had brought on a new logistics coordinator, a sharp young woman with an MBA out of Boston, someone he said would be handling several of their newer accounts. Eleanor asked one polite question about her, the way any spouse might, and Richard gave a dismissive answer, already reaching for his phone again before she had finished her sentence. It meant nothing at the time. It was simply one more small detail in one more ordinary conversation, the kind of moment that disappears from memory within a week under normal circumstances. But this particular detail did not disappear. It would return to Eleanor Ward many months later with a weight she could not have imagined that night. The name Vanessa Cole settling itself quietly into the back of her mind, waiting. There were still good moments in those days, and it would be unfair to Eleanor's story to pretend otherwise. She had coffee twice a month with her old college friend Grace Okafor, now a sharp, dry-witted family law attorney who had built her own successful practice 2 towns over. During one of those coffee visits, Eleanor mentioned, almost embarrassed to say it out loud, that she used to paint watercolors. For now, Eleanor Ward's life still looked, from the outside, like a life many people would envy. A beautiful home, a successful company bearing her family's name, even if it wasn't legally hers. 2 adult children who loved her, even if one of them didn't yet understand what loyalty required. A marriage that had lasted 24 years, long enough that most of her friends assumed it was simply what marriage looked like after the passion faded, quiet and comfortable and permanent. Eleanor believed that too, most days. She had no reason yet to believe anything else. But somewhere in Boston, arrangements were already being made that Eleanor Ward knew nothing about. Decisions that had already been set into motion long before she would ever suspect a single thing was wrong. And on a late Tuesday night, not many weeks from that ordinary dinner conversation, a small notification would appear on a shared cloud calendar for letters and a city name that would change absolutely everything. It was a Tuesday night, close to midnight, when the first real crack appeared in the life Eleanor Ward had spent 24 years building. Richard had told her he was working late at the office, a phrase he had used often enough over the years that Eleanor rarely thought twice about it anymore. She was lying awake in bed, unable to sleep, and reached for her phone to send him a scanned contract he had asked for earlier that day. As the screen lit up in the darkness, their shared cloud calendar quietly synced a new entry, one Richard had entered himself without realizing his wife's phone would display it instantly. The entry read simply, VC, Dinner, Boston. On its own, it meant almost nothing. A vendor meeting, a client dinner, the kind of entry that appeared on that calendar dozens of times a year. But this was the 4th one that month alone, and something about seeing it glow in the darkness beside her made Eleanor's stomach tighten in a way she could not quite explain to herself. She set the phone down on the nightstand and stared at the ceiling for a long time, listening to the empty house around her, the refrigerator humming faintly downstairs, the wind moving through the trees outside their bedroom window. Richard's side of the bed remained perfectly made, untouched, the way it had looked every night that week. Eleanor told herself there was nothing unusual happening. She told herself this was simply what 24 years of marriage looked like. Two people so comfortable with each other's routines that late nights and short conversations no longer required explanation. She almost believed it. She wanted very badly to believe it. But some quiet, steady part of her, the same part that had caught a six-figure invoicing error years earlier, simply by trusting her own instincts, refused to let the thought go entirely. And she lay awake long after midnight, turning the initials VC over and over in her mind. Richard came home at 20 minutes to 2 that morning. Eleanor was sitting at the kitchen table when she heard his car pull into the driveway, the only light in the house coming from the small bulb above the stove, casting long shadows across the counters she had chosen the color of herself so many years earlier. When he walked in and found her sitting there in the near darkness, he paused for only a moment before setting his keys down and asking, in a voice that sounded almost bored, whether something was wrong. Eleanor asked him plainly who VC was. Richard's answer came quickly, smoothly, almost rehearsed in its ease. A vendor contact, he told her, someone handling a new account out of the Boston office, nothing more. Then, before Eleanor could respond, he turned the conversation back onto her, telling her she had seemed insecure lately, telling her she was reading too much into an ordinary work schedule, telling her, gently but firmly, that she was being paranoid. It was an old trick, one of the oldest tricks that exists between two people who have shared a life together for decades. And it worked the way it always works, not because it was especially convincing, but because believing him required so much less effort than confronting the alternative. Eleanor apologized. She told him she was sorry for overreacting, and she meant it in the moment, or at least she told herself she meant it, and Richard accepted her apology with the easy grace of a man who had gotten exactly the outcome he wanted. He went upstairs to bed without another word. Eleanor stayed at the kitchen table a while longer, the stove light humming softly above her, and told herself repeatedly that everything was fine, that 24 years of trust did not simply dissolve because of one calendar entry and one late night. But sleep did not come easily to Eleanor Ward in the weeks that followed. She found herself lying awake long after Richard's breathing had slowed into the steady rhythm of sleep beside her, turning the conversation over in her mind again and again, searching for details that did not fit, then immediately talking herself out of noticing them at all. She typed nothing into any search engine. She checked no messages that were not hers to check. She simply carried the quiet weight of doubt with her through her days, into board meetings, into conversations with her children, into the ordinary rhythm of a life that suddenly felt slightly less solid beneath her feet than it had only weeks before. This was, in many ways, the cruelest part of what Richard had already begun, not the late nights themselves, but the way his easy denials made Eleanor question her own good instincts, the very instincts that had protected the business, and by extension the entire family, for over 2 decades. Around this same time, something small happened at the Ward and Cole offices that Eleanor barely registered as significant. She had stopped by the finance department to ask a routine question about a new consulting invoice that had come through the previous month, a modest line item from a firm she did not recognize. The young employee handling the account, a woman named Priya who had worked under Eleanor's informal guidance for nearly 2 years, hesitated noticeably before answering, her eyes flicking toward her computer screen and then quickly away again. She gave a vague explanation about a marketing consultant Richard had brought on personally, then changed the subject almost immediately, asking Eleanor an unrelated question about an upcoming shipment schedule. Eleanor let it go without much thought. She had 100 small fires to manage that week, and one unfamiliar invoice line item seemed, at the time, like the least significant of them. It would be many months before she understood exactly how wrong that assumption had been. Autumn deepened into a colder season, and Eleanor Ward's suspicions, though never entirely gone, began to soften into something quieter, something closer to the tired acceptance so many long marriages eventually settle into. Richard had not mentioned the initials VC again, and Eleanor had not asked. She busied herself instead with the company, with her children, with the small ordinary tasks that make up most of a life. And for a while it seemed as though the strange unease of that midnight conversation had simply dissolved the way most quiet fears eventually do when nothing further comes to confirm them. That fragile peace ended on a Saturday afternoon in early November, when Maddie came home from college for a long weekend and sat down across from her mother at the kitchen table, her phone already in her hand, her expression carrying a hesitation Eleanor had never seen on her daughter's face before. Maddie explained, in a voice that kept catching in her throat, that a friend from her program had been in Boston the previous weekend and had sent her a photograph almost as a joke, not realizing what it would mean to the family receiving it. She turned the phone toward her mother slowly, as if delaying the moment even by a few seconds might somehow soften what was coming. The photograph showed Richard Ward at an outdoor restaurant table, mid-laugh, his hand resting gently against the visibly rounded stomach of a young woman Eleanor did not immediately recognize, though something in her chest recognized the posture instantly, the easy familiarity between two people who had shared far more than a single dinner. Eleanor stared at the screen for a long moment without speaking. There was no scream, no sudden collapse. Nothing dramatic enough to satisfy anyone watching from the outside. There was only a terrible, total stillness, the particular silence of a woman watching 24 years of assumed certainty quietly rearrange itself into something she no longer recognized at all. Maddie reached across the table and took her mother's hand, tears already sliding down her own face, though Eleanor's eyes remained strangely dry, almost distant, as though some deeper part of her had already begun preparing for this moment long before she consciously understood why. She thanked her daughter quietly for showing her, told her she loved her, and asked for a few minutes alone in the kitchen, watching from the window as the last of the autumn light faded behind the trees in their backyard, the same backyard where she had hosted 23 consecutive family Thanksgivings. It was in that stillness that the pieces Eleanor had been unconsciously collecting for months finally arranged themselves into a shape she could no longer refuse to see. The calendar entries, Priya's hesitation over the strange consulting invoice, Richard's dismissive mention of a sharp new coordinator from Boston months earlier. The name attached to the photograph, she would soon learn, was Vanessa Cole. Richard did not come home that night, and when he finally returned the following evening, he did not arrive as a man caught in a lie, but as a man who had already decided, in his own mind, that the truth no longer required his shame. He sat across from Eleanor at the same kitchen table where she had confronted him weeks earlier over a simple set of initials, and this time he spoke first, his voice calm, almost rehearsed, the voice of someone who had practiced this exact conversation many times before ever having it. He told her he had not meant to hurt her, but that he was no longer willing to spend what he called the rest of his life pretending to be satisfied with something that no longer fulfilled him. He told her that Vanessa was pregnant, that the child was his, and that he wanted a divorce, delivering each sentence with the strange, hollow gentleness of a man who believed honesty alone could excuse everything that honesty had taken him this long to offer. Eleanor asked him only one question in return, for words spoken so quietly Richard had to lean forward slightly to hear them clearly. How long, Richard? Not a question about details, not a plea for explanation, simply a demand for the one number that would let her finally understand exactly how much of her own life had been built on top of a lie she never knew existed. Richard hesitated, his composure slipping for the first time since he had sat down, before finally admitting that it had been 14 months. Eleanor did not respond immediately. Instead, she sat perfectly still, doing silent arithmetic in her mind, matching that number against the calendar entries she had seen months earlier, against Priya's nervous glance toward her computer screen against 100 small moments she had talked herself out of questioning, watching the entire shape of her marriage rearrange itself once more, this time into something far colder and far more calculated than simple heartbreak. Richard's lawyer, it became clear almost immediately, had been preparing long before that kitchen table conversation ever took place. Divorce papers arrived at the house less than 2 weeks later, delivered with a speed and precision that suggested careful planning rather than sudden emotional decision. Buried inside those documents, beneath the expected language of irreconcilable differences, was a claim that struck Eleanor far harder than the affair itself had. Richard's filing stated plainly that Ward & Co. Logistics was a premarital, sole asset belonging entirely to him, and that Eleanor's 24 years of unpaid labor inside that company entitled her to nothing beyond a modest, predetermined settlement his attorney had already calculated on her behalf. In that single document, Eleanor understood for the first time that this was never simply a story about betrayal. It was a story about erasure, about a woman being quietly written out of the very life she had spent decades building with her own hands, one signature at a time. Word spread quickly through their small social circle, the way it always does in communities built on golf memberships and church committees and decades of shared holiday parties. At a gathering at their country club only weeks later, Eleanor watched Richard and Vanessa arrive together, publicly, unapologetically, long before their divorce had even been finalized, while friends she had known for 20 years suddenly found urgent reasons to avoid eye contact across the room. One woman she had once considered a close friend approached her briefly only to explain, in an apologetic murmur, that she felt she needed to remain neutral, for the sake of the company, as though neutrality were even possible in the face of what had actually happened. Eleanor left the gathering early that evening, driving home alone through streets she had driven 1,000 times before, arriving at a house that suddenly felt far too large and far too quiet for one person to occupy. It was later that same week, alone in the house at nearly midnight, that Eleanor finally allowed herself to fully grieve what she had lost. She sat on the floor of their bedroom closet surrounded by photo albums she had not opened in years, 24 Christmases, 2 hospital deliveries, 1,000 ordinary Tuesdays that had once felt permanent simply because no one had told her otherwise. She found her wedding ring in the drawer where she had recently begun leaving it overnight, an unconscious habit she had not noticed forming until that exact moment, and she held it in her palm for a long time without putting it back on. There was no dramatic breakdown, no scene worthy of a film. There was only a woman sitting quietly on a closet floor at midnight, finally allowing herself to feel the full weight of everything she had spent months trying not to feel, before slowly, deliberately, beginning to imagine what her life might look like on the other side of this. It took Eleanor nearly a week to pick up the phone and call Grace Okafor, the same friend she had once shared quiet coffee visits with. The same friend who had listened patiently years earlier when Eleanor confessed she had given up painting somewhere along the way. Grace answered on the second ring, and when Eleanor finally managed to explain what had happened, her voice breaking for the first time in front of anyone since the photograph first appeared on her daughter's phone, Grace did not offer sympathy first. She offered something Eleanor needed far more in that moment: calm, practical clarity. "Come to my office tomorrow morning," Grace told her. "Bring every financial document you can find. We are not going to talk about your feelings yet, Eleanor. We are going to talk about your options." It was, in its own strange way, the kindest thing anyone had said to her in weeks. Sitting across from Grace the following morning, in an office lined with law books and framed diplomas, Eleanor listened as her old friend laid out the situation with a bluntness that felt almost bracing after weeks of Richard's carefully softened language. Grace explained that Eleanor technically faced 2 paths forward. She could accept the modest settlement Richard's attorney had already prepared, a path that promised speed, privacy, and an end to the public humiliation that had already begun spreading through their social circle. Or she could fight for what she genuinely believed she was owed. A share of the company she had spent 24 years building. A path that offered no guarantees, since her name appeared nowhere on the original incorporation documents. And that would likely drag her private life into open, painful, public view for months, possibly longer. Grace did not tell Eleanor which path to choose. She simply made certain, for the first time in this entire ordeal, that Eleanor understood exactly what each path would cost her. The decision proved far harder within her own family than Eleanor had anticipated. Daniel, still unwilling to fully accept what his father had done, urged his mother repeatedly to simply take the settlement and move forward quietly. "It's already humiliating enough, Mom," he told her one evening, his tone carrying more frustration than cruelty, though the words still landed hard. "Dragging this out in court is only going to make everything worse for everyone, including you." Maddie, sitting across the room, could barely contain her anger at her brother's suggestion, accusing him of caring more about his father's public image than about what their mother had actually endured. The argument that followed was the loudest the Ward household had witnessed in years. Two grown siblings shouting across a kitchen table that had once hosted quiet family dinners, while Eleanor sat between them, silent, watching her family fracture along lines she had never expected to see drawn so clearly. Late that same night, long after Daniel had left and Maddie had finally gone to bed, Eleanor drove alone to the Ward and Cole offices, letting herself in with the same key she had carried for over 2 decades. She walked slowly through the empty building, past the conference room where she had once talked 3 major clients out of walking away during the pandemic, past the finance department where Priya still worked, past a hallway lined with framed photographs and news clippings, every single one crediting Richard Ward alone. She stood there for a long time in the darkened hallway, running her fingers along the glass of one particular frame, before finally speaking the thought aloud to the empty office, quietly, almost to herself. She could disappear the way the world seemed to expect wounded women to disappear, gracefully, quietly, without complaint. Or she could do exactly what she had done every single day for 24 years, the work nobody ever saw, until it became impossible for anyone to ignore. By the time morning came, Eleanor had made her decision, and it was not the decision Richard, or even Daniel, expected from her. She called Tom Reyes, a forensic accountant she had worked alongside years earlier during a routine audit, a quiet, methodical man known throughout the industry for his ability to trace even the most carefully hidden financial trails back to their true origin. She told him plainly that she was not interested in a quick settlement, and she was not interested in revenge for its own sake either. She wanted the truth, fully documented, fully provable, laid out in a way no lawyer, no judge, and certainly no husband could dismiss or explain away. Before ending the call, Eleanor mentioned one final detail almost as an afterthought, a strange consulting invoice that had crossed her desk months earlier, one that a nervous young employee named Priya had clearly known more about than she had been willing to say at the time. Tom told her he would start there. Tom Reyes worked in near total silence for almost 3 weeks before he called Eleanor and asked her to come to his office in person rather than discuss what he had found over the phone. Eleanor sat across from him in a small conference room lined with bankers' boxes and spreadsheets, watching his expression carefully, trying to read whatever it was he was clearly reluctant to say out loud. He slid a single printed document across the table toward her, a corporate registration filing for a small consulting firm called Coastal Bridge Advisory, the same name that had appeared on the strange invoice Priya had hesitated over months earlier. Eleanor scanned the document quickly, her eyes catching on the registered owner's name listed near the bottom of the page. It was not a name she recognized immediately, a maiden name rather than the one she now associated with the photograph her daughter had shown her, but Tom confirmed it for her plainly. The firm belonged to Vanessa Cole. What unsettled Eleanor far more than the discovery itself was the date attached to the filing, a detail Tom, made certain she noticed before saying anything further. Coastal Bridge Advisory had been registered nearly 2 full years before Vanessa was ever formally hired at Ward & Co. Logistics. This single detail quietly reshaped the entire story Eleanor had believed she was living inside. This was not simply a case of a lonely, aging husband falling into an affair with a younger co-worker he happened to meet at the office. The timeline suggested something far more deliberate, a relationship, or at the very least an arrangement, that had existed in some form long before Vanessa ever walked through the company's front doors, meaning Richard had not stumbled into this. He had built toward it, carefully, patiently. Over a period of years Eleanor had spent completely unaware anything was wrong at all. Tom spent the following weeks tracing the financial trail further, uncovering a slow, methodical pattern of payments made through Coastal Bridge Advisory over nearly 4 years. Funds quietly diverted from Ward & Cole's operating accounts under vague consulting line items that Richard alone had approved. The total amount, once Tom finished compiling every transaction, exceeded $800,000, money that had never funded any actual consulting work, but had instead steadily built a private financial cushion Richard could draw from the moment he finally decided to leave. Eleanor sat with this new understanding for several days before deciding she needed one more piece of the story directly, not from documents, not from Tom's careful spreadsheets, but from the one person who had lived closest to Richard throughout all of it. She reached out to Vanessa Cole, not for confrontation, but for information. They met at a quiet coffee shop far from either of their usual social circles. Vanessa visibly pregnant now, her hands wrapped tightly around a cup she never actually drank from. Eleanor expected defensiveness, perhaps even hostility, but what she encountered instead was something far more complicated. A young woman who appeared genuinely uncertain about pieces of her own life that Eleanor had assumed she fully understood. When Eleanor mentioned Coastal Bridge Advisory directly, Vanessa's confusion seemed entirely real rather than performed. She explained, hesitantly at first, that Richard had told her the consulting firm was something he had helped her establish years earlier as a professional stepping stone, a generous gift meant to support her early career, long before their relationship had become anything more than professional. She had never questioned where the funding for that firm actually originated, because she had never had any reason to imagine her mentor was quietly siphoning money from his own company's accounts to make the arrangement possible. Eleanor watched Vanessa closely throughout the conversation, searching for any sign of calculation, any indication that this young woman had known far more than she was admitting. She found none. Instead, she found someone increasingly isolated by the same man who had once made Eleanor feel exactly the same way. Someone who admitted quietly, almost to herself as much as to Eleanor, that Richard had told her their marriage hadn't been real in years, that Eleanor had grown distant, controlling, difficult to reach emotionally. The very same accusations Richard had once used against Eleanor directly at their own kitchen table. "He told me a lot of things, Eleanor," Vanessa said finally, staring down at her untouched coffee. "I'm starting to understand exactly how good he is at that." It was, Eleanor realized, the first true, unguarded moment either woman had shared. Two people who had never intended to become allies, quietly recognizing the same pattern in each other's separate stories. The final piece Tom uncovered arrived almost by accident, buried inside an old storage box of early company documents Eleanor had asked him to review simply for completeness. It was a single handwritten page from 1999, faded but still legible, an informal partnership memo drafted during the earliest days of the company, back when Ward & Co. Logistics consisted of nothing more than a single leased truck and 2 young, exhausted, hopeful business partners. The memo outlined a verbal 50-50 understanding between Richard and Eleanor, written in Richard's own handwriting, signed by both of them, though never formally filed with any attorney or incorporated into the company's official paperwork. On its own, Grace explained carefully when Eleanor brought it to her office. The memo held no binding legal authority. But combined with 24 years of financial records showing Eleanor's signature on major contracts, her documented decisions during 2 separate financial crises, and Tom's newly compiled evidence of Richard's long-term financial concealment, Grace finally allowed herself to say the words Eleanor had been waiting months to hear. "I think we actually have a real case, Eleanor. I think we can win this." The morning of the hearing arrived exactly the way it had appeared at the very beginning of this story, gray, damp, the rain only just beginning to let up as Eleanor Ward climbed the marble steps of the county courthouse in her gray wool coat, a single manila envelope clutched against her chest. Only now, having followed her entire journey from that quiet kitchen at 5:40 in the morning to this exact moment, you understand everything sitting inside that envelope. Months of forensic accounting, a faded handwritten memo from 1999, and a truth Richard Ward believed he had buried far too deeply for anyone to ever uncover. Eleanor did not turn around when she heard his car door slam behind her that morning, because she no longer needed to see his face to know exactly what he still believed was about to happen inside that courtroom. He believed he was walking into a formality. He had absolutely no idea he was walking into the end of everything he had spent 4 years carefully constructing. Inside the courtroom, Judge Eleanor Marsh presided with the quiet, unreadable composure of someone who had heard countless divorce proceedings before, her expression giving away nothing as Richard's attorney opened with practiced confidence, reiterating the same claim from the original filing, that Ward & Co. Logistics remained Richard's sole premarital asset, built entirely under his name, his vision, his signature alone. Richard sat beside his attorney in a dark suit, composed, almost bored, glancing occasionally toward Eleanor with an expression that suggested he still believed this hearing was simply a formality standing between him and the life he had already begun living with Vanessa. Eleanor sat perfectly still beside Grace, her hands folded calmly in her lap, giving no outward indication of the storm of evidence about to be placed before the court. When it was finally her turn, Grace rose slowly, deliberately, and began not with accusations, but with documents, laying each one carefully before the judge in a sequence designed to build with unstoppable momentum. She presented the 1999 partnership memo first, Richard's own handwriting, his own signature, establishing an original intention the court could not simply dismiss as irrelevant. She followed it with 24 years of financial records showing Eleanor's direct involvement in every major company decision, her signature appearing on contracts, loan applications, and vendor agreements far too consistently to ever be explained away as clerical assistance. Then Grace presented the piece of evidence that finally shifted the entire tone of the room, a 2011 bank loan application, personally signed by Richard, listing Eleanor Ward explicitly as co-owner of operations, a direct, undeniable contradiction of the very sole ownership claim his own attorney had just finished presenting only minutes earlier. Judge Marsh studied the document in complete silence for a long moment before finally removing her glasses, setting them down carefully on the bench in front of her, and looking directly at Grace. "Counselor," she said, her voice measured and precise, "are you certain this evidence is authentic?" Grace confirmed that it was, citing the bank's own records custodian who had already verified the document independently. The judge studied the page once more, then asked the exact same question a second time, and when Grace confirmed it again without hesitation, she asked it one final time, a third and final confirmation, the very moment this entire story had promised you at the beginning, now finally arriving in full. "Are you certain?" Judge Marsh asked once more. "This evidence is authentic." And for the third time, Grace answered calmly, "Yes, Your Honor, completely certain." Richard's composure, so carefully maintained throughout the entire proceeding, finally began to crack during cross-examination, when Grace calmly walked him through the timeline of Coastal Bridge Advisory, question by question, forcing him to explain under oath why nearly $800,000 in company funds had flowed toward a consulting firm that had produced no actual consulting work. Registered under the name of a woman he had begun a relationship with years before ever formally hiring her. Richard's answers grew shorter, more defensive, his voice rising slightly as he insisted the arrangement had been legitimate, that Eleanor and her attorney were twisting ordinary business decisions into something far worse than they actually were. Sitting in the gallery, Vanessa listened to every word in complete silence, her expression shifting slowly from discomfort into something closer to quiet, devastating clarity, as she heard Richard directly contradict, under oath, in front of a judge, the very explanation he had once given her privately about why that consulting firm existed at all. In an unexpected turn that neither Eleanor nor Grace had specifically planned for, Vanessa's own attorney, present that day to protect her separate paternity and financial support claims regarding her unborn child, submitted a set of corroborating records confirming that Richard had personally described Coastal Bridge Advisory to Vanessa using language that directly matched the concealment pattern Tom Reyes had already documented. Two women who had never intended to become allies, who had met only once before this hearing over an untouched cup of coffee, found themselves unintentionally strengthening the exact same case from two entirely separate directions, both finally standing on the same side of a truth Richard had spent years trying to keep them from ever discovering. Judge Marsh took a recess before issuing her ruling, and when she returned to the bench nearly 40 minutes later, the courtroom fell into a stillness so complete that Eleanor could hear her own heartbeat in the silence. The judge ruled plainly that Ward and Cole Logistics, regardless of whose name appeared alone on the original incorporation paperwork, had been built through the demonstrable joint labor, joint decision-making, and joint financial risk of both parties over 24 years, and was therefore subject to equitable division as a marital asset in its entirety. She awarded Eleanor a substantial share of the company's value, and separately referred the matter of the concealed Coastal Bridge Advisory payments to further financial investigation, a detail that meant Richard's legal troubles were very likely far from finished, even as this particular hearing came to its close. Outside the courthouse, the rain had finally stopped completely, and thin streaks of sunlight had begun breaking through the gray clouds overhead, catching against the wet marble steps in a way that made the entire courthouse entrance seem to glow faintly in the late morning light. Eleanor stood near the top of the steps for a long moment, the manila envelope now empty in her hands, watching reporters who had gathered earlier for an entirely different story quickly reorganize themselves around her instead, calling out questions she chose not to answer just yet, needing this one quiet moment for herself before the rest of the world caught up to what had just happened inside that courtroom. Grace stood beside her, saying nothing, simply resting a hand briefly on Eleanor's shoulder, the kind of gesture that needed no accompanying words between two women who had known each other for over 20 years. It was Daniel who approached first, moving through the small crowd gathered near the courthouse entrance, his expression carrying none of the defensiveness he had shown his mother only months earlier. He had sat through the entire hearing that morning, watching every document presented, listening to every contradiction his father was forced to explain under oath, and whatever certainty he had once held about his father's version of events had clearly not survived the last 4 hours intact. He stopped in front of Eleanor without saying anything at first, then simply placed his hand gently on her shoulder, the same small gesture Grace had offered only minutes earlier, though this one carried an entirely different weight behind it. "I'm sorry, Mom," he finally said quietly, his voice barely audible over the noise of the reporters still gathered nearby. "I should have listened to you months ago." Eleanor pulled her son into a brief, tight embrace, neither of them needing to say anything further in that moment, the fracture between them beginning, slowly, to mend itself right there on the courthouse steps. In the months that followed, Eleanor Ward's life began reshaping itself into something she had not allowed herself to imagine during the darkest weeks of the divorce proceedings. The company, now formally restructured following the court's ruling, carried her name publicly for the very first time in 24 years, not as an afterthought, not as quiet, uncredited labor happening behind the scenes, but as an equal owner whose contributions could no longer be erased from any official document or press release. Priya, the young employee who had once hesitated nervously over a strange consulting invoice, was among the first to congratulate Eleanor personally, admitting quietly that she had always suspected something wasn't right, but had never known how to say so safely at the time. Eleanor told her she understood completely, and that from now on, anyone within the company who noticed something wrong would always have somewhere safe to bring it. Vanessa Cole, for her part, chose not to remain in Richard's life much longer after the hearing concluded, the clarity she had gained that day proving impossible to walk back from once it had fully settled in. She and Eleanor never became friends in any traditional sense, their history far too complicated and painful for that particular ending. But they maintained a quiet, respectful distance built on the strange, unexpected understanding they had reached that day in the coffee shop. Two women who had been deceived by the same man in remarkably similar ways, each finding her own separate path forward afterward. Richard, meanwhile, faced the financial investigation Judge Marsh had referred following the hearing, the full consequences of which extended well beyond the divorce settlement itself. A slow, ongoing reckoning that would follow him for years after Eleanor had already moved fully into the next chapter of her own life. 6 months after that morning on the courthouse steps, Eleanor stood once again in her kitchen at 5:40 in the morning, coffee brewing quietly beside her, laptop open on the counter exactly the way it had been on hundreds of ordinary mornings before everything changed. Only now, the reports she reviewed carried her name directly beneath the company letterhead, no longer hidden behind decades of quiet, uncredited labor. In the corner of her new home, near a window that caught the early morning light exactly the way she had once designed a different kitchen to do so many years earlier, sat a small wooden easel, a half-finished watercolor landscape resting on it, the first painting Eleanor had completed in over 15 years. She had not returned to painting because the court battle had been won, and not simply because the company now bore her name. She had returned to it because, for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, she finally had room in her life to remember who she had always been beneath everything the marriage had quietly asked her to set aside. Eleanor Ward never set out to destroy anyone. She had spent 24 years building quietly, patiently, asking for nothing beyond the ordinary, unspoken trust that comes with any long marriage. But when that trust was broken, she refused to disappear the way the world so often expects wounded women to disappear, gracefully, quietly, without complaint. Instead, she did exactly what she had always done best. She gathered the truth, piece by careful piece, until it became undeniable, and in doing so, she reminded everyone watching, inside that courtroom and far beyond it, that being underestimated for 24 years was never a weakness at all. It was simply evidence, waiting patiently for the moment someone finally knew exactly how to present it.